areas that might need to be protected to preserve biodiversity. And participants also agreed to bring data and participate in a common fisheries resource assessment process in the coming meeting, which will be probably sometime in the first half of 2020. So in my presentation today, I'll be bringing some of my experience of disputes from other areas and relying on some of the examples that I'll draw on from the Atlantic. So in my presentation, I plan to cover the UNCLOS provisions requiring cooperation, examples of fisheries management cooperation while disputes continue, elements of management frameworks in disputed areas and fisheries, consequences of non-cooperation, and cooperation for sustainability. So as outlined in UNCLOS, and we heard a fair bit about UNCLOS yesterday, states shall cooperate and negotiate conservation and management of resources of the high seas. They shall also cooperate to establish regional fisheries organizations, and states shall take measures based on available science to maintain or restore population at levels which can produce the maximum sustainable yield. States bordering an enclosed or semi-enclosed sea shall cooperate with each other to coordinate the management, conservation, exploration, and exploitation of resources, and should coordinate their scientific research and undertake joint programs of scientific research in the area. Regional fisheries management organizations have a mandate to adopt conservation and management measures for fisheries and members of the RFMO. Some RFMOs deal with regional fisheries and straddling stocks, and others deal with highly migratory stocks like tuna. So notwithstanding the provisions of UNCLOS and Articles 118 to 123, disputes and disagreements occur in various parts of the world, especially in relation to transboundary and highly migratory stocks. There's a need for collaborative management and scientific research, even when there are boundary issues that cannot be easily or quickly resolved. Collaborative management and scientific research that provides for sustainable fish stocks and continued economic benefits from fisheries can occur while boundary issues are addressed through longer-term processes. There are situations requiring cooperation to resolve fisheries management and science issues. So where a dispute exists, processes can be established to allow orderly management, joint and collaborative research, conservation measures, sustainable fisheries, and economic benefits to fish harvesters and their states. I'm going to give 3 examples of where a dispute has occurred and the outcomes of those disputes. The first one I'm going to talk about is Norwegian herring and pelagic fisheries. So the Norwegian spring spawning herring, mackerel, and blue whiting fisheries are managed by the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, or NIAF. NIAF sets the total allowable catch for these stocks, but does not have the power to enforce. I'll focus on mackerel, and as the mackerel stock increased in recent years, the distribution changed and the stocks entered the EEZ of Iceland in large amounts. Iceland had a very small share of the total allowable catch and decided to set its own quota. Some other nations followed suit and cooperative quota management disintegrated. Usually, non-cooperative management leads to overfishing and depletion of the stock. The map here shows the Norwegian economic zone, and as the stock expanded, it moved further to the west into the EEZ of the, I'm going to try to use the pointer here, and I don't know if that's showing on the screen up here. It's not, so it moved from this, in this direction into the EEZ of the Faroe Islands and into the Icelandic EEZ. Before 2007, Iceland had a very small harvest of the mackerel stock, and by 2009, it had moved to 116,000 tons. The mackerel stock is now, at this point in time, was at a high level, but the fishery is considered unsustainable due to no international agreement. However, even with the lack of agreement on quota, collaboration on scientific research and data collection continued. The second example I'll bring today is the Canada-EU Greenland halibut dispute, which occurred in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, cooling water conditions prevailed along the edge of the Canadian continental shelf. Other groundfish stocks collapsed, and Greenland halibut stocks, which, like the cold water environment, extended further south and moved outside the Canadian EEZ, and were then intentionally fished by vessels from the EU. Catches along the Canadian coastline declined, and owners of small vessels went bankrupt or suffered severe hardship. As the stock was not managed by NAFO, the RFMO in the area, the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, no quotas or control measures were in place in the international waters, and quotas in the Canadian EEZ were therefore ineffective. This map shows how the continental shelf extends as it moves south to beyond the Canadian EEZ, where the blue areas are at the nose and tail of the Grand Banks on the bottom right-hand corner of the map. Whereas as you move further north, the Greenland halibut habitat extends pretty well right to the coastline and therefore accessible to the coastal vessels. In this case, owners of small vessels in Canada demanded their government to take action and limit catches outside the Canadian EEZ. No Canadian and EU agreement could be reached on management measures for the stock. A conflict ensued, and it escalated to the point where otter trawl warp lines on Spanish fishing vessels were cut by Canadian patrol ships. The conflict escalated to warning shots being fired by the Canadian patrol vessels, and it escalated to quite a tense level before an agreement to negotiate was reached. So an agreement was reached for NAFO management of the stock, and in the following years, quotas and sharing arrangements were established. Measures included rigorous catch reporting and vessel monitoring system, and the scientific assessment is collaboratively conducted on the stock by Canadian and Spanish research ships. Today, the stock is very effectively managed with a management process that ensures transparency in the decreases or the increases in the quota, and is very, very stable. The third example is the gray zone between Canada and the USA. There's an unresolved dispute about the ownership of Machias Seal Island in the Gulf of Maine between Canada and the USA. The island is uninhabited except for the Canadian lighthouse keeper, and the ownership of the island impacts the territorial waters that the adjacent fishing grounds lie in. There are 720 square kilometers of disputed fishing grounds, which are excellent lobster habitat that produce very valuable catches. This shows the location of this disputed zone between the border of Canada and the USA, between the province of New Brunswick and the state of Maine in the US. And this diagram shows the gray area, which is the 720 square kilometer zone, with Machias Seal Island being so small it's not visible in the middle of it. But to the right, you'll see Grand Manan Island, which is in Canada, and the state of Maine, which is in the US. And in the bottom right hand, you'll see that that is the province of Nova Scotia. So it's quite a small and closed area. So without agreement on Machias Seal Island and the ownership of it, harvesters from Canada and the USA both fish the gray zone, each country conducting monitoring, control, and surveillance activities on its own vessels. Conflict between fishing vessels sometimes occur, and sometimes there's destruction of fishing gear between the fishing vessels. Joint management occurs in the gray zone, and there are annual discussions between Canada and the USA. Scientific data is collected by both parties, and scientists collaborate in assessing the status of the stock in the gray zone and the surrounding areas. Now I want to talk about cooperation while matters remain unresolved. The common elements to the development of management frameworks where disputes exist are an agreement to collect and share data, collaboration on scientific research and assessment. Based on the available scientific information, management measures can be implemented, cooperation around monitoring and surveillance, including sharing of information. There are consequences of non-cooperation. The lack of data collection and scientific assessment means that harvesters will likely see stocks decline, but no action is taken. Unregulated fishing occurs. Reproductive capacity of fish stocks is usually diminished. Larger and most valuable species usually collapse first. Then fishing pressure turns to other species and the smaller fishes. Larger fishing vessels often move away to fish in other areas or even in other oceans. Smaller fishing vessels have to fish further from shore, have to stop fishing because it's uneconomical to continue. Ecosystem productivity is lost, resulting in lost revenue to fishing vessels and to communities. Biodiversity is often threatened, and ecosystems take decades to recover, if ever. In Canada, as an example, the northern cod stock collapsed in the early 1990s, closed in 1992, and has not reopened since. So it's a very, very long time. For cooperation in transboundary or highly migratory stocks and sustainable management, there are a number of things we need to consider. Even when disputes exist, parties can continue to cooperate on management measures, data collection, and stock assessments. Management measures need to be considered on an ecosystem approach to fisheries management to ensure sustainable fish stocks and economies. Where fish stocks are transboundary or highly migratory, the economy of fishing communities depend on sustainable fish stocks, and states have to cooperate. Fisheries cooperation is essential to the sustainable management of fisheries and maintaining economies of coastal communities. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Knight. I'm sorry. And it's not. It really shows his rich experience in the fishery management, and he listed 3 cases for us to learn about the experience. And next, I'll invite Dr. Nguyen, a researcher from the National Institute for South China Sea Studies, China, to share the China's experience and the works in the fishery management.
Can you have put on my PowerPoint? Sorry, the IT people, IT group. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Nguyen from China. Well, I've been working in the Institute of the South China Sea for almost 10 years. But I'm not, honestly speaking, I'm not a fisheries expert. That I are very interested in the fisheries issues in the South China Sea. Well, throughout the years, I think that fisheries cooperation in the disputed areas in the South China Sea has very low progress. So I've been thinking about what I should talk about today. So I actually have some connection with the Chinese Academy of Science, who work really hard on marine ranching in China, and that's where I came to this idea. So today I really wanted to talk about the fisheries cooperation among the coastal areas in the south, between the claimant states or between South China Sea bordering countries in the South China Sea. So, sorry. Okay, so before I start my presentation, I think that in my paper or in my proposal, I have 2 objectives to achieve. The first one is to meeting food security and economic development needs of the region, and second is to meet the requirement of sustainable fisheries and confidence building among the South China Sea bordering states. I wouldn't touch upon incident prevention of fishing vessels today, because I think confidence building is even more urgently needed. Well, because in the South China Sea, we have it contains 3,365 species of marine fishes, and in terms of annual total marine production, it's one of the top 5 productive fishing zones in the globe, and it holds 12% of the global fishing catches. So, Maybe I can start with the definition of the marine ranching, because I have no idea how much the audience have known about this idea, so I just give you a brief introduction. Well, the general ideas of marine ranching are releasing the fish juveniles, dismissing species into these artificial reefs underwater, which are designed to protect them from predators at reservation. So the fish takes natural foods, and the fish resources recover the maintained resource and the resources by control fishing sustainability. So marine ranching actually dates back to the Middle Age in Europe and also in China. But more than operational initiatives are mostly on anadromous species like salmon. In terms of modern marine ranching and stock enhancement, between 1984 and in the 1990s, 64 countries conducting stocking activities and reported them to the FAO, and approximately 180 species were released. And very recently, between 2011 and 2017, a total of 190 species were released by 20 countries. Marine aquaculture is rapidly growing in Asia, the Mediterranean, and other seas across the world. And the United States and Japan is the leading country in terms of marine ranching. Then I wanted to introduce a bit about the Japan's practice of marine ranching. Well, it has Japan is a very important maritime state in the world. It has a long tradition in fish farming and is currently one of the largest producers of aqua and mariculture products in the world. Marine ranching forms a very important part of Japan's fisheries policy. They started it in the 1960s and 1970s, while since the 1970s, stock enhancement marine ranching involves species like salmon, scallops, and sea bream, and has expanded dramatically. Over 80 species of anadromous and marine species are currently hatched and reared in Japan, and by far most important in terms of volume, salmon, especially chum and scallop. Okay, this is how the conservation of the coral reefs underwater. And then I wanted to introduce China's practice in terms of marine ranching. Well, China's definition of marine ranching is a bit broader than just stock enhancement. It's an umbrella word covering fisheries, aquaculture, habitat conservation, capture-based aquaculture, and ocean engineering. So China marine ranching was developed in history in the 1970s, and it's a type of aquaculture involving the cultivation of marine organisms for food and other products in open sea and in an enclosed section of the near ocean. Early attempts in China involved sinking old boats and using manufactured reefs to change seabed currents and encourage algae to grow, which in turn attracts other marine species. Well, today the approach involves placing artificial reefs on the seabed, releasing juvenile fish, and encouraging the growth of kelp forest. Well, so far, China has more than 230 marine ranches along the coast. So it's very close to the coast, and mostly are in the northern China. And because China is rather big, there are different types of marine ranching. They have, in terms of the different purpose, well, like I listed 3 main types. The first one is for conservation. The second one is for stock enhancement. The third one is for tourism. And the marine ranching, the average cost of marine ranching is averagely 5 billion yuan to create one, but it will generate 31 billion yuan in revenue each year. So this is a typical Chinese marine ranching in northern China, in Shandong province, because in northern China, along the coast, there are many high-value species which are profitable to the local fishermen. So they have this sea cucumber marine ranching in Shandong province, and it is the biggest. It is the like a pilot province in China who has done many good pilot projects in terms of marine ranching. And on the left, there are the artificial fish reefs. There are different shapes of them, different types of them. They're put on the seabed to attract fish to come and to yes, to create to help build the eco-friendly marine offshore area. And what is more relevant is the first and the biggest tropical marine ranching in the southernmost province of China, or the Hainan Island, where I came from. Well, this is a marine ranching of Wuzhizhou Island. This is a very, very small island in my province. It's less than 2 square kilometers. Well, the island is very small, but it's very well designed. It's divided into 2 parts. The western part focuses on conservation of coral reefs and fishes, and the eastern part are mostly open to tourism. So it's a combination, it's a complex marine ranching. And because I wanted to introduce this because this is a marine ranching in the tropical area, in the tropical region that we can that is a pilot project in my eyes, and we can probably introduce to the South China Sea bordering states. Well, this is the eastern part of the island of the Wuzhizhou marine ranching. Well, they have this ocean fish competition like every year, and yes, this is the fish that they fish on the island. It's very tropical, most popular tourist destination in China, and. So far, until the end of 2018, they have artificial fish reefs of 1,400 and the fishes of like 1 million juvenile fishes like every year. Okay, so now I wanted to look at the current and ongoing bilateral fisheries and aquaculture cooperation in the region between China and the South China Sea bordering states. These cooperations are in the non-disputed areas along the coast, and I think they are. It's important to mention them. And the first one is between China and Vietnam. China and Vietnam has a very good cooperation in the Gulf of Tonkin, and the pictures is between the 2 states to release the juveniles in the Gulf of Tonkin. And I will skip this part because Professor Nguyen will talk about this in much detail. But so far, China and Vietnam released 43 million fries of 8 species, including the groupers, the sea breams, in the Gulf of Tonkin. And between China and the Philippines, well, China and the Philippines has already an MOU on fisheries cooperation since 2004, and it's still valid one. And also, we have the Joint Committee of Fisheries Cooperation, JCF, and the JCF has already conducted 3 meetings. The latest one is in July this year. And under this MOU and this JCF, the 2 countries will have the willingness to cooperate in terms of deep sea breeding and aqua processing in the province of Davos, and fingering breeding and deep sea cage culture, etc. And also China would donate 100,000 leopard coral grouper seeds to the Philippines from 2017 to 2019 continuously. And also between China and Malaysia, there is a cooperation of shrimp farm. It's a joint venture among the private sector. There are 2 private companies between the 2 countries, and it's an ongoing project. I think it started since 2016, but it's like it can. I hope that if in the future it could become a marine ranching of shrimps conservation, and it's a good example and try. And China-Brunei also has a joint venture of a fish farm, and it's an ongoing one. And it is reported that it will have like $300 million of output per year after they put into use. And China and Indonesia has this MOU on fisheries cooperation. And then I talked to the people of the Chinese Academy of Science, and they say that they are already talking about a cooperation of marine ranching with Indonesia, and they hope that we can have some outcome in the next year. So that's where we are now. So my suggestions and conclusions is that I personally think that confidence building is still very urgently needed among the South China Sea bordering states. That's why I wanted to initiate this fisheries cooperations along the coast of the bordering states. And the second, and also I think we should build on the already established cooperation projects that we already have, and maybe we can move it forward to the marine ranching. And second, and then finally, I think a good model that I introduced to you is the tropical marine ranching in Hainan Island, and which the tourism type can be an example for the South China Sea bordering states to think about. And then that's basically my proposals for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we switch this. Thank you, Yan. Yan has shared with us the aquaculture and the stocking fishermen called the ranching. Marine ranching experience of China in the coastal part and in the tropical part of China. And she mentioned that the fishery corporation could be take the stocking enhancement and the marine ranching as the first step. Thanks, Yan. And next, I will invite Dr. Mudjekeewis Santos from the Philippines, National Academy of Science and Technology, to share the what Philippines' perspective on the fishery management. Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to DAV for the invite. This is my first time to attend this wonderful conference, and this is also actually my first time in Vietnam. So needless to say, this will be a very memorable experience for me. When we search Google for South China Sea map, one of the top hits will be this one. And as a fishery scientist, I like this one much better. And I'd like to think about the fish that lives in there and the people that depends on them. Now, it's fortunate or perhaps unfortunate, depending on how you see it, that the South China Sea is one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. Not all seas are rich in fish, but South China Sea is. And we have known for some time now that the organisms living in the South China Sea are connected, for example, in their larval dispersal. And even their genetic makeup, we already have seen evidence, some publications in our lab show that they are connected genetically. And it has been published in 2016 that the South China Sea produces around 11 to 17 million metric tons of fisheries catch, valued at about at most $22 billion fisheries landed annually, and it provides around 3 million jobs. However, it's also beset with a number of issues like overfishing, biodiversity and habitat loss, altered ecosystem trophic structures, resulting into a fish down state. Now, and we need to address this one, and some publications already, like that of Zhang, already posited that we can have a common objective for the fisheries cooperation in the area, like achieving food security and economic development, ensuring sustainability, ensuring sustainable fishery and protecting the marine environment, and preventing fishing conflicts and disputes. And I think these objectives are attainable. In fact, the folks in the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue argued for this one because they already seen some commonalities in the national laws and policies concerning fisheries and the marine environment among the 5 claimant countries. And in fact, we in the region have started to dwell into more details of this cooperation. Just recently in press, we published our work in a workshop, and we've already found some commonalities in, for example, fisheries statistical issues, among the 5 countries that we need to review and looked at. And we have already identified high priority issues common to us in terms of insufficient control on fishing capacity, fishing efforts, as well as weak law enforcement. Now, looking at the Philippines, for the information of everyone, we are 80% water, and we have the 5th longest coastline in the world. We are a top fish producing country in the world as per FAO. We are a distant water fishing nation, same as the US, the Spain, China. Our commercial fisheries can fish very far away. We are said to be the center of marine shorefish biodiversity in the world. And very recently, our marine resources have been evaluated conservatively at almost $1 trillion US. Unfortunately, it's also what we call the center of marine adversity because of the presence of maybe all the threats that we can think of. 70% of our population lives in the coastal areas. Our fisher folks have been reported to be the poorest of the poor, and we do have weak institutional systems such that we are considered also one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change impacts. Focusing on the West Philippine Sea fisheries, we do have a nationwide landed catch and effort monitoring since 1998. We monitor around 900 fish landing centers. We check the fishing ground, boat and gear. We ID the fish. We weigh them and we measure their size. We look at their reproductive biology, and we compute for reference points or indicators for monitoring and evaluation. And for the west side of the Philippines, regions 1, 3, and 4B, as you can see, the top species, the top fisheries there includes the squids, the tunas, the scads, anchovies, and even the mahi-mahi. We do have lots of mahi-mahi being landed in that area. And in terms of the fishing boats and gears, many of the commercial fishing happening there are by Danish seine, purse seine, trawl, bag nets, and ring nets. And in terms of indicators, looking at the status of the fisheries, we've started to compute for that. This is just one example, the exploitation ratio. Unfortunately, as you can see, many of the stocks in these areas are in red. Some are in yellow. The goal is for them to be in green. I'll not discuss about the technicalities of the exploitation ratio, but that's the idea, to make them green. Then how do we do this? In the Philippines, we do have the Philippine Fisheries Code, and more specifically, we do have the Comprehensive National Fisheries Industry Development Plan. We have 6 strategies, and very specific for that one is strategy number 3, where we want to implement science-based conservation and management measures. And I just want to draw your attention to these 3 because this is connected to my presentation. Implement science-based measures to rehabilitate domestic stocks, restore fishery habitats, and protect spawning grounds and spawning cycles. So how do we do this? We do fish enclosures for commercial fishers, targeting small pelagics, and we do have that in Visayan Sea, the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Davao Gulf, and northern Palawan, as you can see in our map on the left. So many of them are fairly recent, and I just want to show you this one and see. So what now? Impact assessments published in 2018 by our university show that there are positive impacts of the close fishing season in terms of volume of catch and number of workers in the Zamboanga Peninsula for the sardine management. 2011, we do have produce 1 million cans a day during peak season. Now it's around 5 million cans per day during peak season. For the northern Palawan, we do have increases in CPUE since 2015 for the SCAD mackerel. And we are very happy that even the municipal fishers or the artisanal fishers are enjoying the fruits of these commercial fishing closures. And we also believe, aside from the main Philippine fishing closures, we also believe that one of the things that we need to do are developing and establishing marine protected areas. As you can see there, in fact, we do have the National Integrated Protected Area System, and we've just amended this one and expanded it. Under these laws are many of the MPAs that we have. We call them by different names because of the different legal definition. But all of them right now are defined or under marine protected areas. And we're moving towards MPA networks because many of our MPAs, as you have seen, are small and not properly integrated. And studies have shown that MPAs into networks can improve capacities for relevant management bodies and therefore enhance contribution of these MPAs into food security, ecological balance, and poverty alleviation goals. But right now we need to issue a joint memorandum circular because we don't have any national policy yet on marine protected area network. And the first thing that we did is define for us what is an MPA network, and we looked at it as a connectivity of at least 2 MPAs based on ecological, socioeconomic, and governance considerations. What does that mean? To us, MPA networks can be ecological, meaning it's connected by larval dispersion, for example. Socioeconomic MPAN, where they're not necessarily connected by larval dispersion, but are connected by markets, and even governance MPAN, where the MPAs are connected by law enforcement, for example. And we can have all the 3 together. And we believe that, and this has been shown in many studies, that close fishing season and MPA network will make a significant contribution in terms of sustaining our fisheries. And so we're now moving towards that. We're moving towards an ecosystem approach to fisheries management, and very recently we put up this fisheries management areas where the Philippines has divided into 12 FMAs with 12 management boards, each with management boards and each with science advisory groups. And so as a summary, and I pose this as management questions for me as a scientist or for us as scientists, is that I think the things that we need to do are to answer what is the definitive status of fish stocks and fisheries in South China Sea, because we don't have that collectively. Could we do fisheries data sharing, joint surveys, joint reporting? Is that possible? I hope so. What do we know about the extent of MPAs in the SCS? Right now, I think we're trying to work on that, as Morley has mentioned, through Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And could we network these MPAs, and how? And lastly, I think, based on my experience and our experience on fishing closures and MPANs, if the science is credible and understandable, competing stakeholders tend to agree and cooperate. And this is, imagine closing a big area for fishing in the Philippines with so many stakeholders. Some said it's impossible, but we did it because the science was there. And cooperation in fishery science, contributory to joint fisheries management, I think is really possible in SCS. And at the end of the day, SCS, I think, it should be a food security issue. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mjis. Thank you. You shared the domestic fishery management in the Philippines and make a blueprint for the future of the South China Sea fishery management. And now I'll invite Dr. Khac, Nguyen. Can I pronounce it right?
Yeah, you can
from
call me Batman, easy to remember.
Yeah, okay. From the Vietnam Institute for Marine Fisheries to share the China and the Vietnam cooperation in the Tonkin Gulf. Thank you. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair Madam. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bat from Research Institute for Marine Fishery. I'm the director of the institute. And today I will present status of marine fishery resources in the Central Tonkin Gulf between Vietnam and China. and it's prepared by myself and Dr. Jung Yong from South China Sea Fishery Research Institute, China. As you may know that in 2004, Vietnam and China signed a fishery agreement, and this agreement lasts for 12 years and automatically extend for 2 years. In this joint fishing area, that's the total of 33,500 kilometers square, and under the fishery agreement that our two institutes from China and Vietnam have to carry a survey every year to have the scientific base for the fishery management. So we, based on the scientific evidence, to decide the license for the coming years. So we use 12 survey already in the periods from 2014 to 2016, and we carry 4 surveys a year in January, April, July, and October. So this 4 times is representative for 4 seasons in the Tonkin Gulf. At the beginning, that we survey independently, but after 2 years, we have changed our way that we join survey together. So we use the data together and share the data together, and we send the observer from other side to check on our data. This is a survey board, and from Vietnamese side and from China side. In this area, it's very diversity. So we select 18 important species, I mean that commercial species, to check on the biological aspect for those species. So here are some of the main reasons. This figure that show you about the species diversity in this area, and you see that the number of species, it fluctuates. Seasonal fluctuation. Is it in the center of Tonkin Gulf? So it can have the migration pattern from the inshore to this area. And you see that very clearly, that the seasonal pattern. But in this area, you can see that very high diversity, and the season very clear. From the species composition that you can see here, that for I list here on all the species contribute more than 1% of the total catch. And you can see that the first species with 17% is low value species, and the rest is value species. The catch variation in the period from 14 to 16, as you can see in this figure, it has the tendency of increase. However, if we compare to the previous time, as you can see here, that it has the tendency from begin in 2011, it has a tendency of decrease. And this catch variation that we break down in the category for low economic and economic species, and we can see that the tendency of those categories. For biomass in this area, it can see very clearly that we have the tendency of decrease the biomass from 2011 up to now. Actually, we already have data for 2019 already, but it not updated for in this presentation. But you can see that the biomass is reduced about 40% compared to at the beginning of the study in 2006. So we look at the quantity, and now we look at the quality of the catch. As you see, that we use the trophic level to see that how the quality of the catch change. And you can see that from 2014, 2016, that the trophic level is quite stable compared to the 2011 to 2013, but it has a tendency of decline compared to the previous time. So based on our studies, that we can conclude that marine fishery resources is a very highly diversified and seasonal fluctuation in the area, and the stock decline both in quantity and quality, as the density reduced and the biomass reduced and the trophic level reduced, and it really need stronger management action and conservation action. In this area, and also that cooperation play very important. I think it's very good that we have very long data series. Up to now, we have 15 years survey in this area, so it can have very clear evidence to show, so I can tell you here that cooperation play very important. So besides the cooperation for fishery management that between Vietnam and China, we have many other programs to cooperate with, like stock enhancement in the Tonkin Gulf, and we have a strategy for fishery management. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bet. But it's just sharing some of the joint cooperation, joint management in the Tonkin Gulf between China and Vietnam, and make a conclusion that we have many other programs still in the Tonkin Gulf for both of the governments to deal with in the future. And now all the presentations are finished in our panel. It seems that we see another picture from yesterday we are experiencing in the sessions of the South China Sea. We see the possibility for the future cooperation between the China and the ASEAN member states in some of the pragmatical issues such as the fisheries. As far as I'm concerned, all of the 4 presentations make a conclusion that the fishery management cooperation is a necessity in this area, and it's possible to enhance those kind of cooperations. However, I find some distinction between the method used to enhance the cooperation. Mr. Knight sharing the 3 cases for us. Most of them used our IMFO to get fishery management, and Nguyen shows the possibility to have the aquaculture and the marine menching, and Dr. Muji suggested maybe MPAs for the future, and Bat says we have more opportunity for the bilateral cooperations in the Tonkin Gulf. So the measures or the method that they took is a slight different from each other. So what I'm concerned is about, I have 4 questions raised for all the panels. Firstly, what is the first step you think to promote the fishery management in South China Sea right now? And the second one is related to that, is that the RMFO or MPA is necessity in this area, or just a choice for the parties? And it is possible right now for those countries to have their sufficient data or a mutual trust to build such a kind of organizations? This is my second question. And third, maybe about how to balance the management of the fisheries and the demand for the proteins or development of on these regions. That relates to sustainable development, because we know that in many other regions, the demand for development and demand for food is not so urgent as in this South China Sea region. So I want to hear about your opinions on that. And finally, we'll see that in the presentation of Nguyen and Dr. Mudjekeewis and Bat, we find that there's many corporations on the bilateral level on the fishery management. And I think the next step might be institutionalized of those corporations. So how to make the combine together and the upgrade to the multi-level corporations. That's my questions to the panels. So can you reply it?
Thank you very much. I think that was a good summary, and I think your questions are very good. The first question about the first step to promote sustainable fisheries management, I think, is a key question in terms of the dynamic that we see overall. We see declining biomass. We saw it in the study presented by Dr. Bat, and we also saw some indications of that in the data presented by Dr. Santos. And I think there's numerous studies out there to indicate that the productivity of the South China Sea is decreasing because of the level of fishing. So it indicates that the biomass has been fished down to a level where productivity is less than what it should be, and that probably means that fish stocks aren't producing the maximum amount they can produce. In other words, they're not meeting the UNCLOS objective of producing at the maximum sustainable yield level, and that is likely because of overfishing on the populations possibly at the inappropriate time while they're in the juvenile stage or while spawning is occurring. And I think one of the first steps to promoting adequate fisheries management is to try to have better collaboration on assessment of the stocks and thinking about it. And Dr. Santos mentioned this point as well. From an ecosystem approach to fisheries management, it is not adequate just to assess a stock on its own merits. It has to be assessed based on not only the sustainability of that stock, but also the role that it plays in the ecosystem. For example, some very important bait fishes are the food source for many other stocks, and if they're being fished down, it's not only impacting that stock, it's having probably a more dramatic effect on the other prey species as well, and in many cases will also impact on the migration patterns of these very important prey species, which are the species like tunas, for example, that are very valuable and very important for many countries. Your second question about RFMOs, or I think the question was about the basis for an RFMO or marine protected area networks, and I think they're both very important issues, but yet very separate. I think marine protected area network is very important. Recently at our workshop in Manila that I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of interest in that, not only in demonstrating what marine protected areas are out there, but looking at the gaps. If there's gaps from an ecosystem basis in the migration pattern of certain key species, maybe there's a need for more collaboration on establishing marine protected areas in the areas where gaps exist to protect the juvenile stages or the spawning areas, as the case may be. An RFMO would obviously be an ideal outcome if parties can come together and jointly agree to manage fish stocks under the umbrella of an RFMO. And that, of course, is a step that usually takes many, many previous steps to get there. Most of the RFMOs that have been formed are the result of a lot of years of collaboration at bilateral and multilateral levels before they get to the RFMO stage. So I would encourage the bilateral and multilateral cooperation to continue, and hopefully in the longer term to move towards an RFMO. The balancing of the management of fisheries at sustainable levels is a very important and a very daunting challenge. As I mentioned earlier, there has to be consideration at the ecosystem approach, and there also has to be the economic consideration, because in making changes to how fisheries are managed, there's always an impact on the people who are depending on that fish for their livelihood and for their income. And that impacts on communities and impacts on states, and in many cases, making drastic fisheries management measures can have a very detrimental impact on coastal communities, and particularly on smaller fleets of smaller vessels that can't go very far. The larger vessels can move to other parts of these oceans and even into other oceans, but from my experience, the biggest impact is the suffering that occurs in coastal communities when fisheries are placed on a moratorium, and that in many cases has to happen to protect the fish for the future, but it does have a very detrimental impact on the coastal communities. Your final question about how to increase cooperation, I would encourage all parties in the South China Sea to be very proactive in sharing data and sharing the science information that they have. I think that's a really important step towards coming together in terms of helping each other to understand the state of the resource and helping come to agreement on what needs to be done to protect it. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, I do, in terms of meet the requirement of food and protein, I do think that aquaculture is still the most important way in the region to safeguard the food security and also to promote economic development. And that's why I propose the idea of marine ranching. And secondly, you asked me about the bilateral cooperation and multilateral and institutionalized. I think it's just, it's not easy to upgrade the bilateral one into a multilateral one. But I do think that there are probably two areas that we could work on among the states, but multilaterally. The first one is the stock enhancement, because we already have bases and foundations bilaterally, the stock enhancement of certain species in the rivers. I think that's in the sea. I think that's probably one area. And the second is of moratorium in the disputed waters among the states, because Professor Santos also introduced the fishing closed policies of the Philippines, and China has a similar one since 1999, and the moratorium policy of China does not cover the spread lease, but it has been ongoing for more than 20 years, so probably we can start from that for multilateral cooperation. And third, regarding the MPA and RMFO, I personally think that MPA won't be very easily to achieve in the South China Sea, because when it comes to designated certain sea areas in the disputed waters, it's just so difficult, especially in the South China Sea compared to other maritime disputes in the whole world. The different difficulty and complexity of the South China Sea is that it has more than 200 features: the low tide elevation, shores, islands, reefs, and everything within the waters, instead of just maritime delimitation. So it's just highly complex. So it probably is not easy from my personal point of view. And regarding the RMFO, I think I do agree with Professor Nai's suggestions just now. Maybe we can continue our bilateral cooperation first, because I do think that confidence building is still the what we need in the region. And also, last year I wrote a short piece, a commentary on the fisheries and the COC. I personally think that probably the fisheries management could be a contributing factor to the incident prevention in terms of, since the COC negotiation is ongoing. So maybe under this framework, we can find a new way to help fisheries cooperation in the region. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. A lot of questions. Well, for the first step, as I mentioned in my presentation, based on our experience, I call it science is a great equalizer. And as I said, if the science is credible and understandable by all parties, then you get some cooperation there. The fishing closures were not easy. Imagine the commercial sector fighting with the artisanal fisheries and all. But we did it, and I think it's because the science was there. And so I think as a first step, we need to do the science. Science meaning done by the countries, not done by any scientist from the West or something, and agreed upon by all scientists in the region, and then us trying to sort of make that understood to our policymakers. I think that's one good step. Regarding the MPA, yeah, I think it's kind of difficult. It also came out during the Manila workshop that we had. But I think in terms of marine protected area network, maybe that's possible. As I have said, in the Philippines, our concept of marine protected area network is not only ecological, it's also socio-economic, it's also governance. So we do have our MPA, own MPAs, but then we network them in terms of governance, in terms of socio-economic linkages. And then we can strengthen these individual MPAs in terms of their contribution to food security. And how to balance, I guess, as Morley has mentioned, this is one of the headache of fisheries managers and fisheries scientists. But I think based on our experience, I think consultation is really key to this process, and transparency. Transparency not after the strategy, not during the strategy, but transparency even before the strategy is thought of or planned. Meaning everybody, stakeholders, everyone is already consulted at the start of all these processes, and the science is there. And based on our experience, everybody is good. And we identify certain issues, for example, that's what Morley has mentioned. For example, in our fishing closures, the fish workers are taken out of their livelihood for 3 months. So what do we do then? Because stakeholders are involved, other government agencies like the Department of Social Welfare and Development comes in, and they help out because that's their mandate. And so now it's sort of, we have a sort of a balance in terms of how to move forward and sustainably manage these resources, and yet we help those people that are affected. And in the long run, hopefully, just like what we see in the sardine management, we now have 5 million cans a day during peak season. And for the bilateral cooperation, to me, any cooperation is good, whether bilateral or multilateral. But sometimes it's only on paper. I think key is how to really implement it on the ground, because if it's only paper, then we cannot do anything.
Yeah, I think I just want to add some comment on the item that about the ban of the protein and then management. I think that we haven't used optimically that for utilization we haven't used optimum way. It's very lucky that in the tropical area that very rich and diversified, and species normally have very short lifespan and very fast growth, so it can tolerate very high fishing pressure. So it's very lucky for our area. But we haven't have the best way to manage it. So I think from scientific point of view, we can have more study on how to use it in the optimum way. For example, like we can change the fishing gear structure. You only know that the auto-choy will destroy the ecosystem and get everything. So we can change the fishing gear and we can use another way, so we can find a way. And besides that, of course, aquaculture play very important for to provide protein source. Another thing you talking about the management, and I think that in our area, there are still many areas that we have no data, and it's very important that if you want to do something, you need to have data on that area. And you can see from the outside area of the Tonkin Group mouth, in that area that we have very lack information about species, about the fishery in those areas. So I think those new areas can have more data on this. And in terms of cooperation, I think scientists talking to scientists very easy, actually. But they need two things. One is agreement from government. And the second thing that they need the budget. So if they don't have that two things, they cannot do. So I think that we can find a way to support the scientists to have that two way, so we can do more. That's my idea.
Okay, thank you all the panelists. And now I'll open the floor, and its questions is welcomed and encouraged. Okay. So many. Oh, 4 hands. So we will collect questions about five. Yeah. We'll collect all the questions and answer.
Okay, I'll start first. Thank you for your 4 presentations. They are very beautiful and very significant. And we mostly know about the current situation and the fishing and the preservation of the fishing stock in our sea in general, and South China Sea in particular. And mostly, for me, I understand that you are most referred to the fishing ground. And this is very nice. But my question is that recently we are working with the two terms, that is fishing ground and traditional fishing ground. We have right to fish in our fishing ground according to the Enclosures 1982. But for some countries, if we have traditional fishing ground, but this fishing ground, traditional fishing ground, may be shared with other countries, how do you preserve the fish stock? And is it applicable or eligible to the Enclosures 1982? Thank you.
I'm sorry, is the question to Nguyen or all the panels?
Yes.
To Nguyen, just to Nguyen. Okay, thank you. I think this the first line, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your very insightful presentations and discussion. I'll have a question to the Dr. Yang from China and Dr. Khac from Vietnam. Interestingly, both of the presentations mentioned the cooperation in the Tonkin Gulf. And with regard to the South China Sea, as far as my knowledge is concerned, our disputes are happening around parcels. So according to the Vietnamese news, it's often reported that the Vietnamese fishermen are harassed by the China's law enforcement agency's vessels, and they are arrested and they are confiscated, and they demanded to pay compensation. So I know well that this is a very sensitive area politically and emotionally. However, as far as I listened to your presentations. It seems to be a better idea to seek constructive and productive way for fishery management in the parcels. So what kind of conditions, politically or in other ways, enable both countries to, pursue such a policy, like as long as territorial disputes are not resolved, how to manage the fishery stock or fishery itself, managed by both countries. Thank you.
Please help me pass the first line. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Two questions for Dr. Batt and then one for the panel. So it was a 2004 agreement with 12 plus 3 years, 15 years. So it expired this year, 2019. So what's happening now? No agreement? Has it collapsed? And secondly, your numbers indicate a 40% fall in 5 years in fish stocks in an area that's being jointly managed. That sounds like a catastrophe to me. And a question for the whole panel, SEAFDEC, no one has mentioned it. Southeast Asia Fisheries Development Center based in Bangkok. Is it irrelevant to these discussions?
Any other questions? Oh, okay.
Yes, it's partly a statement in support of Dr. Santos' observation, and it's possibly a plea for the next panel on polar regions. I've worked with the South Pacific fisheries programs as well as the Antarctic ones, and the difference between the two is that in the South Pacific we had an independent regional authority to get the fish stock data, and that allowed us to argue against the distant water fishing nations very effectively. In the Antarctic, the fisheries management depends on self-reporting of the fishing states, and that's proved woefully inadequate. In fact, I think the vast majority of regulated stocks are failing. So I guess it's a question for the panel. To what extent is there a possibility for an independent region-wide authority to do the stock taking for the South China Sea area? Thank you.
Okay, I will invite my panelists to answer the questions. You start from you, or it's from Nguyen? Okay.
I'll start off with some general commentary on the, starting on the last question, actually, about the potential role for an RFMO or a authority to collect consistent data. In my experience in RFMOs such as ICAT, for example, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, it's a large RFMO, and to a very large extent, it tends to almost consume itself with data collection. And I make that point for two reasons. One, because it can become probably overshadowing some of the other measures of the important work of the RFMO, but at the same time, it just, I think, emphasizes the importance of data collection and consistent data collection from all parties in an RFMO context. So I understand why self-reporting wouldn't work very well. Somewhere in the middle of that, there's a balance of having the right data collected, and I think that's one of the ways that ICAT may have maybe failing, I should say, in that it just goes into too much detail and tries to collect too much data, which is overwhelming for the wide variety of capacities in the 50 states that form the ICAT organization. So I would say that critical to the future management of fish stocks in the South China Sea is some process to collect data and where all parties agree on the consistent collection of the data that's needed and essential to the management of stocks. But I would caution that in that process, there needs to be a lot of good judgment used in what data is collected and considering the capacities of all of the various fishing vessels that fish, for example, something like mackerel, scad, to be able to collect that data. So it needs to be kept relevant and practical at the same time. That brings me to a comment about CFTEC. I think CFTEC is a treasure trove of information and data for the parties that are members of CFTEC, and they have been very collaborative with HD in terms of providing us with data. They've also been conducting some surveys, so I think they are a relevant organization, but without expanding it to all parties of the South China Sea, then that's a lacking point. But as I mentioned earlier, in some of my previous comments, the best way for multilateral cooperation that might lead to an eventual RFMO is to have bilateral or multilateral cooperation in as many forms as can be generated. I would also say, in response to one of the other questions from the floor, that it's never easy to get to a point where there's a consistent approach to fisheries enforcement and surveillance. It's always difficult, and in my experience, things have to go through steps. And the first step is having credible data collected so that there's a basis for some science assessment. And then I would reiterate Dr. Santos' point that the science has to be understandable and accepted by all parties, not just the scientists. And it's a common failure of the science community to produce scientific reports that they can all understand and not really well understood by the stakeholders and the industries that are impacted by the science. Hopefully, out of the science, there can be agreement on adequate fisheries management and conservation measures. And if there's agreement on consistent measures for stocks that are highly migratory or straddling from one EEZ to another, then there's an opportunity to build a basis for commonalities in the management regime among the parties. And once that occurs, there's a good likelihood that there can be agreement on cooperation and collaboration between the regimes in place to enforce the management regime that's put in place. And you know, that's a multi-step process, and I don't think it's possible to get from here to there in one step. I think it has to follow the trajectory where there's confidence building along the way and there's cooperation and collaboration at all points along the continuum. Thank you.
Thank you. And first of all, regarding the question of traditional fishing rights, well, I personally think that the beauty of fisheries cooperation is that there is no boundary for them, no boundary for fish. So, so that's why we need a conservation of fish. So I don't think my presentation has a direct link to the questions you asked, but I do wanted to mention that traditional fishing rights, to remind you that it was originated from the activities of the local fishermen, and is established in the course of the consolidation of historic elements. And also, in practice, significant fisheries interest plays an important role in the negotiation of maritime delimitation, and that's where traditional fishing rights comes from, and then also fisheries management between the coastal states. And I do wanted to say that after the adoption of the UNCLOS, traditional fishing rights continue to exist in the context of general international law, and it constitute a relevant factor in the maritime delimitation. Its coordination with the UNCLOS is mainly reflected in maritime delimitation and the allocation of fisheries resources. And second, regarding the parasols issue. I think the Chinese government is very clear that there is no dispute in the parasols, but there is a joint working group between China and Vietnam working on the maritime cooperation, and has been, and I think it's an annual one, but sometimes it will stop. And the two countries did talk about the cooperation in the waters outside the parasols territorial sea, and I think I hope that cooperation negotiation is still ongoing. And regarding to the 2004 China-Vietnam agreement, well, as far as I know, I think the two countries have agreed that it will be extended, but probably it's not yet officially announced. But I do need a confirmation from Professor Nguyen from Vietnam. And regarding to the regional arrangements, I think I couldn't do better than Professor Knight, so I skip that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, just continue with the agreement between Vietnam and China. So actually, in 2019, it will be expired. So this year will be expired. So yes. Actually, two sides have been discussing about the new discussion about the new cooperation in the future. So I think the both sides already have some maybe 1 year for discussion for the cooperation in the future after the agreement finish. And you have been asking me about the reduce of biomass. Here is actually after the first stage, we divided different stages of 3 year, 1 stage. So after first stage, we assess the stock, and we see that the stock decline, and we have two government, two ministry have decided to reduce the license in the area, and it have to slow down the decline chain. However, that because of social and economic point of view, and we still from our advice that the committee cannot like we suggest to reduce 30%, but they agree in like 10 or 15 something. But of course they agree with us. So after 15 years, that's the biomass reduced after 15 years, not from 1 or 2 years. And I think you have another, and you can see that from our result that the quantity is reduced sharply, but the quality is quite controlled quite well. It means that the jackfish contribute to the trophic level. It's quite high.
Yeah, actually, Morley stole my comments. So, yeah, CFLEX still, of course, relevant. We can get, and we do get a lot of scientific information for South China Sea, for works that's being done by CFDEC member countries. In fact, we're now doing a regional eel management program under CFDEC. And about the independent authority, I guess that's the ideal, although I think to me that's really very difficult in our area for now. I would take the one step at a time approach. If we can get scientists in a room, in a sort of an informal technical working group and produce something, then that can be used by our managers in the region, then I guess to me that's already significant.
Okay, thank you for all the panelists, and we still have much time, and I'll open the floor for the second round. Okay, Professor Kong, maybe, and Professor. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. I'd like to give a very quick comment. As a lawyer, I would like to add something from the perspective of international law. I think for any country with adjacent or opposite coast, in a maritime delimitation situation, the fishery issue or fishing problem must be addressed or dealt with by the state concerned properly. Before they have a final solution of the maritime delimitation dispute, in the process of their own negotiations, or they request a third party like the ICJ, ETLOS, or some other tribunals to effect maritime delimitation for themselves. It is also a problem for the parties even after the boundary had been eventually, determined. For example, we have so many countries signing provisional arrangement in terms of fishery and fishing problem before they are officially engaged in negotiation concerning maritime delimitation, like China and Korea, Japan, and in many other parts of the world. And during their negotiation or consultation over maritime delimitation, for example, between the USA and Canada, in terms of the boundary in the Gulf of Maine, you have, 20 years of negotiation, and finally you went to the court and request the court to delimit a certain section of the maritime boundaries. And in that process, for the court or for the parties, you have to consider or take into account fishing issues. And then after the boundary has been settled, it's still a problem. For example, in one case, Trinidad and Tobago, this is Tobago, it's arbitration. The tribunal does not have jurisdiction over this issue, but it still encouraged the party to find a solution on their own. After I give you a final decision of your boundary, but you do have fishing problem. You need to reach an overall solution on your own based on agreements. So for me, I think for the parties in the South China Sea, they have to think about delimitation and very pragmatical cooperation in terms of conservation and management of fisheries very carefully, in the long run, not just focus on clarifying the claim or disputed area or even delimitation. Otherwise, fishery issue cannot be properly addressed in the long run. That's my comment. So my question goes to the panel. All the presentations are very informative for me, especially from the two scientists. As we all know, the COC consultation is ongoing, and it has been suggested by some panelists, conservation and sustainable development of fishery should be incorporated into the text of the COC. So what would be the key element from your perspective that should be incorporated into the text? And what would be the key element for implementation? Thank you.
Okay, Professor, you have the floor. Yeah.
Navy Captain Jung Yong from South Korea. I would like to make questions to all speakers. The fishery dispute is easy to escalate the physical confrontation among the relative parties and other stakeholders. As you have heard some South Korea's case with China and North Korea, some of the neighbors' comments with North Korea is due to fishery dispute. And we also have some physical confrontation with Chinese illegal fishing, the vessels in the Yellow Sea, even though we have a certain agreement with Chinese authority. So we just talked about some manageable measures to avoid some differences, but you may think about or have to be establish some certain the mechanism to avoid such the physical confrontation. So I would like to ask for speakers about your personal opinion on that. Thank you.
Okay, we'll invite our panelists to answer those questions. Start from Vietnam and the Philippines friends, okay.
I think that as a fisherman, when they're fishing, so normally they, of course, they have equipment and they can be alarmed the area that you are not allowed to fishing or something. But like in Vietnam, most of fishermen, when they follow the fish, they just follow the fish. So I mean that the fish have no border, so it's moving, so the fishermen follow the fish. So in that case, that I think the border become how to say, it's not like not easy, because in that case we need to have kind of agreement in like the joint fishing area, the area that the fish can migrate or they can move, and like in Vietnam and China case, that we have the joint fishing area. So when we have agreement, the case happen in that area is reduced sharply compared to before. So I think that one of experience, I think that the country says the stock should have that kind of agreement.
Very difficult questions. Like defending a dissertation or something here with all of you as panel. All right. Okay. Regarding the two questions, which I think are they have some similarity in them in terms of what do we do in terms of the mechanism for cooperation, based on what we've sort of suggested. I'm going to say this as a scientist without any knowledge about law, international, or something. And based on what I've experienced in the Philippines, fisheries management is really complex because our fisheries in the region is very, very complex. It's very different from the temperate areas where you have a couple of fish and very standardized fishing fleets. Here it's crazy, actually. That's why when I was invited, I thought of what do I share with the group in terms of how we can move forward with this thing, and that's why I sort of focused on the fishing closures, because I think, and the marine protected area network, because those are the two things I think among the many things that we do are sort of maybe relevant to the South China Sea. You see, when we did the fishing closure, you can imagine like the northern Palawan, it's a lot of stakeholders. There's commercial fisheries there, there's municipal fisheries there, there's academic institutions. And within the area, you have local government units around. So as I see it as a sort of similar to South China Sea. Now, so we just focused on one specific management strategy, is to protect the spawning mothers in a specific spawning area. So for me, if we can maybe identify, for example, a specific spawning area in the South China Sea, and we discussed that at first with all the stakeholders, as what we have done, I think it's doable. So what happened with our fishing closures, because we discussed the science with the stakeholders at first, and in fact, we did get some information from the commercial fishing fleets themselves, so they were part of the discussion. And then when the law was passed, everyone was on board with it. And so now every fishing closure, even the commercial fishers themselves, will not go to the conservation area. Something like that. For me, as a mechanism, maybe we can have such way where the countries can agree in a certain spawning area that we can protect for a certain period of months during their peak spawning. And then I think we can have some contribution in terms of sustaining the fishery. Not thinking about the many IUU or what law enforcement issues there, but just the spawning, trying to protect the babies and protect the mothers when they are giving birth. I think that we can do that. For the marine protected area network, that's why I emphasize network, perhaps we can select a few marine protected areas where can we jointly sort of manage them in such a way that we look at them at the socioeconomic standpoint or governance standpoint, and then we strengthen all of these MPAs while not joining them together, but actually managing them together. And so I guess that the contribution of that one is, again, becomes significant to the sustainability of the fisheries. For the key elements, I don't know if I want to dwell on what kind of words we can put there. I guess science-based fisheries management would be one that I can suggest. Thank you.
Okay, I think I will take a privilege of the moderator to say something about the Yellow Sea illegal fishing. I think it's, the situation in the Yellow Sea between China and Korea is very different from the situation in the South China Sea, because China and Korea has signed a provisional arrangement before the pending the maritime delimitation, final delimitation. They set the provisional measures in certain area, certain sea waters. I think the problem or the conflict is not relating to how to management, the fishery management is more related to how to make the law enforcement activity. Maybe sometimes China thinks it's more it's used over forcible measures from the Korean side. So I think it's another issue from that. But mostly, if China do the illegal fishing in the Yellow Sea, you'll get fined by the Korean Coast Guards. So it's another issue. So I will invite the my other two panelists to.
Thank you, Chair, for helping me out. Because thank you. It's a love and peace panel. So, thank you, Chair, for your help. Because I honestly, I'm not an expert in the Yellow Sea, and especially the fisheries cooperation between China and Korea. So I think that's the answer from her point of view. And regarding another question of the COC and the fisheries cooperation, well, I do think that there are two areas. Two parts of the COC that can incorporate fisheries. The first part is cooperation among the contracting parties, and the second is incident prevention. And in terms of cooperation, I think we've already talked a lot about this. Like probably we can share scientific data among the states, and also I suggested that just now we can conduct a moratorium or a fishing ban closed season. Maybe we can start from like not a complete ban of a closed time, certain piece of time. Maybe we can start from like one species that is in danger, like the giant clam. We can start from that. I think people would agree that there are certain species that is urgently need to be protected. And also in terms of cooperation, we can start from the breeding cooperations of the certain species of fish, and also the like planting of clams. I think the Philippines have been done a good job in terms of planting the giant clams. So these are like the areas of cooperation that I think it could be incorporated. And in terms of incident prevention, there are so many tragic stories of fishing boats, fishing vessels, and fishermen died in the South China Sea. And I think probably, well, it's just very innocent thinking. Probably we could work on the AIS system on the fishing boats, because the economic development is so unbalanced in the South China Sea bordering states, especially for fishermen and the fishing boats. Many of the fishing boats, there are no AIG. Is it AIG, the satellite system on the boat, so people just cannot locate each other. So it's really dangerous, especially in the South China Sea when there's a typhoon and there's low, shallow waters, and this is completely dangerous. And also secondly, in terms of incident prevention, I have talked to many of the law enforcement officers in the region, and people say that there is one problem of managing the fishermen because we don't speak the same language. You see, that's true. I was told by many of the law enforcement officers from the region, and I've been thinking about probably we can start from language training course among the fishermen of English, not Chinese. Okay, so that's the practical issue that we're facing. So that's just innocent thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start off by making the case that jurisdiction is not the most important issue and factor for managing fish and having sustainable fish stocks. I'm going to go back to what our learned colleague gave as the example of the Canada-US jurisdictional issue on Georges Bank in the Gulf of Maine. And that issue was settled, and there's what we now refer to as the Hague line from the Court of the Hague. That settled the boundary issue. And of course, that's a separate area from the one I talked about earlier today, the gray zone. When I worked for the Canadian government, part of my role was the head of delegation for Canada in the annual bilateral steering committee with the US to try to manage the Gulf of Maine stocks. And what I would say is that while the jurisdictional issue was settled long ago, it really makes little difference. It maybe makes some difference for sedentary species that live on the bottom, like shellfishes, but for the most important species there, it makes very little difference. What's required is the annual data collection, the annual science assessment, and then to come to some agreement based on how much of the biomass is on one side of the line or another, and that seems to shift every year for some reason or other, that the cod stock this year is 60% on the Canadian side, and it's 40% on the American side, and 3 years later, it's the reverse. And when cod shift one way, the yellowtail shift the other way. So what I can say about it is that while it can delimit where the fishing vessels can fish, it really doesn't make that much difference, because the fish still swim to both sides of the line. The parties have to collaborate and cooperate in the management, the science and the data collection, and they have to collaborate on having consistent measures in terms of the fish sizes and how much will be taken in any given year. So that's my case, that jurisdiction is not the most important issue when it comes to managing fish. I think what is most important, and I'm going to repeat now what Dr. Santos has said, is what the most important message is that there must be science-based fisheries management. And once you have that, you can have cooperation on measures, and maybe not even on shares, because getting to determine who can take what percentage share of a fish stock is always very, very difficult. It probably ranks right up there with agreeing on boundary areas, because once those shares are fixed, they seem to become permanent fixtures. So I would suggest that that's not a good first step. A good first step is to agree on common management measures and measures that protect the species and protect the spawning biomass. For example, what's often referred to in fisheries management and science terms as the SOM 50, the size of maturity where 50% of the fish reach the size of maturity before they're harvested seems to be a globally recognized important measure. And if you could implement a measure where 50% of the females had a chance to spawn before they were caught, then you can probably have sustainable fisheries. Where the fish are caught then becomes much, much relevant, and the parties can agree to the measures to take them during certain seasons or to allow them to grow to a certain size. So I think I would reiterate and close up by saying jurisdiction is not the most important issue. Science-based fisheries management is the most important issue.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. And I'm really very happy that we have discussion, have a very deep and detailed discussion on fishery management in our roundtable. And I think it will not contribute to the conserve of the fish stocks for the next generations, but also will enhance the mutual trust between the coastal state and lead to a pragmatic cooperation in the South China Sea. And I will thank for all the panelists and the audience for your good questions and comment. And I'll say that our panel or our roundtable is closed right now, so you can enjoy your tea. Congratulations.